My title could be amended to read a new and connected history of local French vernaculars and their many contexts, including their material and performative ones. And I hope you'll find that this paper is a fitting, perhaps, footnote or appendix to the beautiful presentation we just heard from our colleague Florent. So what I want to do today is trouble our understanding of the emergence of the French language as some sort of a linear and teleological process. We're all familiar with maps like the one here, which attempt to, albeit fuzzily, delineate the different dialects of the entity that would become the hexagon of France. But of course, even a map like this refuses to acknowledge the dialects of French that were emerging in Britain or in Italy or in other parts of the world. So one of the hindrances to really understanding the emergence of Roman in all of its vernacular forms, of course, is the processes of nationalism and interior colonization, which give us this French nation. And we can see this really at the very, very beginnings of medieval philology in the 19th century. So, for example, Paul Meyer in the 1860s was dispatched by the French government to catalog manuscripts of French national culture being held captive in the libraries of Great Britain, as his title seems to suggest. So this was a virtual attempt to repatriate something like the Chanson de Roland and bring it home to its proper place in France. And of course, this coincided over the 1870s, a tumultuous decade in the history of the French nation state, with attempts like that of Godefroy to codify the Old French language along lines that would be acceptable to the Académie française. And the fact that this is all happening, as I mentioned, during the emergence of the German Empire and German nation state as a major rival, and indeed, as was perceived, an existential threat to the French nation, means that at this very moment of codification of Old French, this means an incapacity to deal with the complexities of that shared political and linguistic border. So as we all know, the tragic loss of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871 during the Franco-Prussian War memorialized in famous artworks like Betonier's La Tache Noire, ironically in the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin, and the consciousness not only during the Franco-Prussian War, but during its successive wars, like that of the First World War, that this divided empire of Charlemagne is constantly being torn apart and contested between or among multiple powers. And I don't have time here to talk about the complexities of Belgium and Flanders and all of this, or I should say the invented nation state that we call Belgium, and that was invented in 1830 after the Napoleonic Wars. So what this means is that the earliest manuscript artifacts of those things which will come to be held up as the prototypes, the canonical examples of la langue française can't be appreciated as the really interesting crunchy variants that they are. So, for example, the very famous Serment de Strasbourg, the Strasbourg Oaths, recorded for the very first time in this manuscript from around the year 1000, late 10th century. So notice not contemporary with Nithard, not contemporary with the actual Strasbourg oath-taking ceremony in 842. Rather than looking at this manuscript and its transcription of the oath into a variety of Frankish and into a variety of Germanic, and just appreciating the amazingness of this recording of an oral tradition, it has to become contested. It has to be ripped apart, not literally, but figuratively. These two different linguistic strands cannot be appreciated together. They have to be fought over. So this is all happening in this momentous decade. At the very same time, in addition to nationalism and the process of French becoming, which has been an ongoing process since the time of Philip Augustus, and I'll get to that in a minute. We also have the radical decontextualization of the remnants of various Romance vernaculars. So, for example, in Edmond de Cussemaker's Drame liturgique du Moyen Âge, we have, for example, egregious examples of de Cussemaker going into the medieval manuscript record, looking for generic things that he can call drama, literally scraping them out of the manuscript record, presenting them as facsimiles, when in fact they are not facsimiles at all. So we see here his attempt to create a liturgical drama that he calls sponsus, which is the oldest extant Occitan theatrical document that we have. But it's embedded within a larger Latin liturgy. De Cussemaker could not deal with the fact that Latin and Occitan would be jumbled up together, so he scraped the Occitan out of the Latin and put it into this radical decontextualized context, which does not imitate what it's doing in the manuscript, either musicologically or dramatically. We could go on and on. So, for example, the Jeu d'Adam, another one, Ordo Representationis Adae, another one of these prototypical, quote unquote, French texts, has been the topic of, more than a century's discussion over its real provenance. This is a very, in my opinion, silly sort of zero-sum argument. Yes, the dialect is clearly predominantly Anglo-Norman, but the manuscript, which is probably 40 or 50 years into the future of the actual composition, was produced somewhere in the Norman, Anglo-Norman realm of Provence, in the Angevin territory. I'm sorry, in the former Angevin Empire. But of course, the manuscript only it's the oldest extant French manuscript on paper. So it's also indebted to the trade in paper from North Africa or Iberia coming into the south of France, enabling the documentation of this Anglo-Norman play. What is the real origin of Le Jeu d'Adam? It's all of these things together. Another impediment to understanding this whole process has been the insistence on a division between Latin and Romance, between literacy and orality, which happily Paul Zumthor taught us to question deeply. And this is a division that was insisted upon by our medieval predecessors as well as by modern scholars. And I'm just showing you here a couple of examples of the monastic historians of northern France complaining bitterly that the narratives of the First Crusade, which are circulating widely in Europe, are not being created by monastic historians, but are being created by those slimy combatants who actually came back from the Holy Land and are telling the story in their own ways. Maybe in Latin, maybe in Romance. It's hard to know. They're obviously very upset about it, no matter what is going on. Whereas the oldest, the text that is the most closely associated with the actual events that we call the First Crusade is circulating in various formats, oral, written, we don't know, for at least 70 years before it finally finds its way into its oldest extant manuscript. And indeed, we have wonderful examples, again, of monastic historians from all over the Francophone world, or what is now the Francophone world, complaining about the existence of Romance or Latin storytelling traditions. I love the Geoffroy Vigeois talking about this guy, Gregory Bachada, a knight of most exquisite talents, who had written a whole huge volume in his maternal, yes, that's what I said, guys, his maternal tongue. And it may actually be this text that is ascribed to Gregory Bachada may in fact be that thing which materializes as the fragmentary chanson or canso d'Antioche. And again, you can decide whether you're going to be a Catalan nationalist or a French nationalist, depending on what you want to call this text. One of the ways to sum this up, and one of my favorite stories that Patrick Geary tells, is about his joy at finding out that his book, Before France and Germany, note the title, that he had published in 1988, was going to be translated in time for the French bicentenary celebration in 1989. But as you see, it was translated as La naissance de la France, because we cannot mention the existence of l'Allemagne in the same title as this one. So that's part of the process. And of course, we're learning, thanks to the work of Colette Beaune, translated by Fred Chayette into English, to understand that the mythology of la nation de la France, la langue de la France is very much a late medieval project, which is then, of course, carried forward into the modern world. But we can set against this teleological nationalist narrative the kind of extraordinary work that we've just heard about that Paul Zumthor is doing. At the same time, we can point to the extraordinary work in the last couple of decades by scholars whose work I highly recommend. Simon Franklin's work on early Rus and his attention to what he calls the entire graphosphere, the entire graphic environment in which these oral traditions are being disseminated and encoded and understood even by the laity, and this extraordinary book by Warren Brown and colleagues, which proves that the laity were always intensively involved in documentary activities, even in the early Middle Ages. And that, in fact, the process that we're looking at in the 11th and 12th centuries is actually the shutting down of opportunities for the laity to actually participate in their own ways in the documentary process. And that is the topic of my current book project. So let's just take two brief examples. One, I want to talk about the very early 11th century, when we're seeing the attempts, slow, chancy, fragmentary attempts to document Romance languages. And we'll look at one place where we're seeing this happening, and it's in a surprising place. It's in a place, Conques, which has almost no documentary tradition, even within the monastery of Conques itself at this time. But a documentary tradition begins to crystallize around the very famous cult, or now famous cult, it wasn't famous at the time, of the Sainte Foy, and all you art historians will be very familiar with this gorgeously monstrous maestas of Sainte Foy. And the documentation of the cult of Sainte Foy begins with a man who has usually been referred to as Bernard of Angers. And in my current project, I argue that Bernard is not from Angers. He was the schoolmaster there for about 3 years, but he was actually a local boy from the Rouergue. So he's been misunderstood, for example, in this excerpt, as making fun of the cult of Sainte Foy and other similar cults in southern France at the time, as in this excerpt where he's talking to a companion of his, Bernier, who has come down from the school of Chartres, where they were both students together, and they're visiting these monstrous little cults in the south of France. And Bernard tells us that he carefully spoke to Bernier in Latin, so that the local people wouldn't be offended by what he said, but also because I posit he and Bernier do not speak the same variety of French. So rather than assuming that Bernard is speaking some dialect of the Languedoc, he is actually, I am positing, a native of this region down there in the Diamond. I've identified a few of the possible places where he could have gone to school. I love the idea of Aurillac, because Aurillac is the home of Gérard of Aurillac, who became a pope, who was the teacher of Fulbert of Chartres, who was also the teacher of Bernard himself. But what I love about Bernard's account of the documentation of the miracles of Sainte Foy is that he makes it very clear that the idea of documenting what average people say is so completely crazy to the monks of Conques. And he chides them. He says, why haven't you been keeping any track of what people have been saying? And the monks are like, oh, it's just so annoying. All these people come and claim they've had miraculous interventions by Sainte Foy, and we can't be bothered. And as he says, there's no one in the patria, and this is very important. There's no one in my homeland. He's not saying there's no one in this countryside that I despise. There's no one in my homeland who actually knows how to do this. So I'm going to do it. That's basically my argument. And so he gives us extraordinary details about how he sits with the different local people who are the living witnesses to Foy's miraculous intercessions, and he is doing his best to set down, albeit in Latin, what they are telling him word for word, just as he hears it from their mouth. And he's doing this as he tells Fulbert in an open letter, which is appended to his miracle collection. He's doing this, he's going to send these miracles to Fulbert so that Fulbert can do what Fulbert does, which is disseminate the news of Sainte-Foy's cult to his entire network, his far-from network from Scandinavia to Hungary, of people who will then disseminate these miracles far and wide. And that's what puts the cult of Sainte-Foy on the map for the first time. At the same time as this is happening, or maybe a generation later, Sainte-Foy becomes the beneficiary of, once again, the oldest allegedly surviving literary artifact in French, Occitan, Catalan, you can choose, but it's none of those kinds of things. It's a contact vernacular, a pilgrimage patois made up of lots of different types of linguistic elements, which is meant to advertise the cult of Sainte-Foy to people going on the pilgrimage routes. It's now divided up into 5 different little bits and pieces, but what's becoming very clear to me is that the entire assemblage was intended to advertise, to basically be a pre-packaged liturgical kit. You want to have a cult of Sainte-Foy, here is your kit. You've got notated offices, you've got miracle collections, and moreover, you can tie it into the brand new cult of Mary Magdalene, which is emerging at Vézelay, so that when people go to Vézelay and they hear about Sainte-Foy, they will come to Conques as a little detour before they go on to Santiago de Compostela. So that is what this manuscript is intended to do. And at the very end of this compendium, you then have this documentation of the Chanson or Canso de Sainte-Foy. So that's an example of how if we sort of strip away some of these narratives of the becomingness of French, and we really appreciate the hybridization of language and culture that is going on here, we can get a much better picture. And of course, it's thanks to these extraordinary efforts of Bernard and of the unknown composers of the Chanson de Sainte-Foy that the Abbey has enough money to build this tremendous Abbey church and all of its amenities. And of course, the documentation of Foy's miracles continues, especially in the local area around Rodez. So from there, just another brief case study of vernaculars in action. So if my first case study is gives us a glimpse into the process by which the vernacular comes to be scripted or controlled or transmitted or recorded in various documentary forms, we can turn to the late 12th and 13th centuries to look at a different situation. A vernacular, that of Picardy, which has already become, by the end of the 12th century, the prestige vernacular language, the prestige French of the world, which is being exported to a whole lot of new places. And here we can pick up on the work of Gabriele Spiegel's Romancing the Past, which again shows that it's the French of Picardy, of Flanders, not the French of the Ile-de-France, that is becoming the great language of communication in this period. I obviously speak to this in my book. And one of the things that historians of medieval languages have shown is that one of the things that makes the Picard dialect of Arras so potent is that it takes on a literary documentary form so quickly, and therefore the gap between the spoken language and the written language is actually quite narrow. And I can go into that later if you want. But what's going on, of course, in this period is that Arras is transitioning from being an independent city-state within the independent county of France, but is being absorbed violently into the burgeoning empire of Philip Augustus, the very first king, as John Baldwin, and this is one of the books that was my Bible when I wrote my dissertation, the very first king, as Baldwin teaches us, to style himself not Rex Francorum, king of a bunch of people called the Franks, but king of a sovereign territory called Francia, which we now have to defend, because the more times you claim sovereignty, the harder it is to defend that. So Arras becomes absorbed into this emerging Frankish kingdom, but not without a struggle. And as a result of this, its prestigious vernacular also becomes absorbed into the Kingdom of France. I'm showing you here the oldest extant pragmatic text in any dialect of the Languedoc. This is the coutumier of the Confraternity of Jongleurs, with the Carité de Notre-Dame des Ardents d'Arras, which is itself an extraordinary document. I was telling Florent, I didn't think I would ever go back to Arras, and now I'm back in Arras again, but I have more to say about this document in my book, but basically what you can see here are 27 or 28 different hands asserting the power and authority of this confraternity. This confraternity was established by Jongleurs, and les Jongleurs en sont seigneurs. The Jongleurs are lords of it. But basically, you can see here, even within this one city, 27 people with very different educations, very different types of scribal training, and indeed different morphologies, saying things about their confraternity over a long period of time. It's Jean Baudel, the great fabuleur and playwright of this period, is obviously not only a member, but probably a founder of this confraternity. He is the clerk of the Échevin of Arras. As I argue in my first book, Jean Baudel's Jeu de Saint-Nicolas is an allegory, a satirical allegory of the process whereby Arras becomes absorbed into the Kingdom of France. The pagan king in this play is not a pagan king, it is Philip Augustus and his rapacious insistence on absorbing Arras and its wealth into his kingdom. But we only have this play, Jeu de Saint-Nicolas, because its sole surviving copy is put into a massive compendium of works by Jean Baudel's successor by many generations, Adam de la Halle. They would never have known each other. Jean Baudel died in 1210. Adam de la Halle was probably born in 1250. But Jean Baudel is still, generations after his death, associated with his fellow Aragois poet and composer. And that Adam de la Halle, because he's the first, he is the only at this time composer to write polyphonic motets in the vernacular. His works benefit from the extraordinary scribal competence that is necessary for the transcription of polyphonic music, mensural notation. All of this work is put together into a compendium, which I argue was produced after Adam's death as a memorial document. And it is moreover produced in the context of Adam's journey to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies with his hapless uncle, Charles of Anjou, who has found himself the King of Sicily. And has found himself battling a major urban uprising by the citizens of Palermo in 1282. And one of the things I'm arguing is that the reason why the Jeu de Saint-Nicolas is even in this manuscript is that it was brought to or maybe memorized by Adam and was performed again in Bari at the Cathedral of St. Nicholas at some point during the reign of Charles in the 1280s. The other works in this, the famous Jeu de Rôle de Bain and de Marion in this compendium is not merely a Sicilian product, but it has a prologue addressing the people of Arras and contains scenes in which the people of Arras basically barge into the Sicilian court and interject their own interesting politics into the Sicilian courtly experience. And moreover, as I've argued in a recent piece, the Jeu de Rôle de Marion is a savage satire and critique of Charles of Anjou and indeed possibly of Robert of Artois' involvement in the oppression and colonization of the peoples of Sicily. And indeed, so it's the aftermath of the Sicilian investors that brings Robert and Adam in his entourage to Sicily. It's where Robert composes this play, which is not just a cheery musical comedy, a pastorelle, but is a musical in which the shepherdess doesn't get raped by the knight, unlike the women of Sicily, who have been raped by the Angevin knights. And in fact, in which Robin calls for an urban uprising, attaqahan, against the Angevin imperialists in Sicily. Robin actually shouts out, "Arro," which is or Arras, as it would be in Normandy. This is the cry to rise up against your oppressors and overthrow them. So we see here a fascinating way in which the politics of Arras, the politics of Sicily, the language of Arras being exported to Sicily, but then being used in a new way to address the concerns of the local population. The reason why Adam is in Sicily at all is to produce this, which he never finishes. He writes about 100 lines and he can't get through it. He doesn't like epic poetry. He doesn't like Charles of Anjou. So he dies before he can finish this. Maybe he kills himself so he doesn't have to. I don't know. No, I'm kidding. As I mentioned, the reason why we have this codex at all is that it is a memorial to Adam, which happens to include this sole surviving copy of the Jeu de Saint-Nicolas, made almost 100 years earlier. So back to Beata's point about loss. I'm going to skip over those things and just kind of conclude here. This is all about why I always have too much material. So one of the things that I've had to grapple with, and this is something that Sarah Guérin talked about yesterday, is one of the reasons I found I had to return to Arras, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity of this conference to do that, is because I did not know in 2007 when I published this book how to deal with the Sicilian elements. I thought they were completely extraneous to my story. This was a story about Arras. And I'm coming to realize that this is a story about Arras in its global context, a story about the exportation of its vernacular and the uses that the vernacular plays in other places, and the extraordinary sort of linguistic, cultural, ethnic, religious mixing that is going on in the medieval world. And, the wonderful shout out to our hostess Rinka's beautiful book on les fixeurs au Moyen Âge, which will be coming out in an English version soon. So I wanted to take the opportunity of this conference to think through some of the things that I've been working on in my new book, but also to return and maybe in penitence for the errors or the omissions of my first book, which really did not know how to deal with this extraordinary connectivity. And I just want to mention here that there's amazing work being done now. This is a young Turkish scholar and others on what we can learn about the emergence of the French vernacular in Outremer from Arabic sources, because we have Arabic sources that are phonetically transcribing the ways that people talk in the Holy Land. And that are, they're creating glossaries, but in this case, Ibn Munkid, who is a fixer, writes in one of his major works a lot about what, how do you understand what these weird people are saying. And of course, a shout out to our colleague Patrick Boucheron for his Histoire mondiale à France. So to conclude, I'm sorry, a few minutes too late. The l'idole des origines, as Marc Bloch warns us in his beautiful Métier de l'historien, the idolization of the origins of any language. And again, I could give the same lecture about English, it's, people are doing the same thing with Beowulf in the 18th century. Is it Danish? Is it German? Like, yeah. But what this has done is it has obscured a very long history of romance development over a longue durée. And instead of just appreciating its hybridity, it's been forced into a particular trajectory. It's been, and indeed the Enlightenment agenda, quote unquote, my students know I always say the so-called Enlightenment, says Professor Symes, has been reverse engineered onto the medieval past through a radical decontextualization and eradication of vernacular varieties and voices, encouraging us to draw sharp lines between French and Latin, between various, dialects of Frankish, making it hard to see the local and connected uses of this vernacular, and to trace how its forms are morphing and changing, why idioms are traveling, why certain vernaculars become contact vernaculars and others are not, and hindering the study of what is a true lingua franca, not a pure language, but a contact vernacular, a patois, a creole. And I know that these are I once told an English colleague, you know, well, Anglo-Norman is a Creole, and he almost killed me, you know, just because the ethnic associations of this. But if we embrace that, if we embrace these facts, we're getting a little bit closer to understanding this world. And just, you know, to a final conclusion, we can even expand this map and think about French as the language which goes with Marco Polo to China, and the language in which Rustichello of Pisa, sitting in a prison cell in Genoa with his newfound buddy, transcribes the great Arthurian romance, which is in the Livre des Merveilles. So we even have that larger Eurasian connection. So thank you so much.